This is Josh Mandel with another episode of a Guided Walk Through FHIR, and we're continuing with our progress through the FHIR Clinical Safety Checklist. And so let's review our progress up to this point. We've made it through the first several items of the FHIR Safety Checklist in previous videos, and we've gotten up to the step number 8, which is looking at the way our system ensures checks for patient links and or merges and handles data that is linked to patients accordingly. Okay, so this is the first item on the safety checklist that doesn't actually include a hyperlink to any particular area of the FHIR spec that we could refer to for details. And so I'm going to do my best interpretation of what this is probably talking about, starting off with patient links, and we'll use that for the entry point into a slightly broader discussion about how FHIR manages different people inside of the healthcare ecosystem. So we're going to go to the FHIR spec, and we're going to look at the patient resource. We've seen the patient resource plenty of times in these videos up to now because it's kind of our go-to, because everyone's got a pretty good intuition about what a patient resource is. It's a resource with a name, a birth date, and a gender, and all the basic demographics you would expect about an individual patient inside of a health system. But this time we're going to scroll down a little bit in the data model and take a look at this here, the link. And so the patient link data element here is optional, and it's repeating, which is to say that a patient can link out to 0 or more other related resources. And the relationships here are typed. So a patient can link to other patients or to related persons for different reasons. And these reasons are coded by a link type. So let's first of all review the link types, because anytime we talk about this relationship here, we'll be pointing to another resource and we will be specifying as a required element here the type of the link. So here are the link types that are defined in the core spec. And before we actually read the details, let's just see the binding. This binding is a required binding, and the link type is a code. Now, what this means is this is not really an extensible list. This is the full set of types that the FHIR spec defines. And if you've got your own, you could maybe try to put in an extension or something, but you'll always need one of these types. Future versions of FHIR could extend this set, but this is basically what we've got to work with. This is not just an example or a preferred value set binding. This is a required binding. And that's why this element shows up as a code rather than a more general type like a coding or a codable concept. So there's 4 link types that we've got to deal with here. One is called replaced by. And so this means the patient resource containing this link must no longer be used. The link points forward to another patient resource that must be used in lieu of the patient resource that contains this link. And so this is pretty important. If you're building a client connecting to a server and you go and fetch a patient resource and you see this patient has a replaced by link pointing to another patient, this is something that's really important to know about because it suggests that you really shouldn't be querying for data about this patient or referring to this resource as a source of truth. And instead, if you see that replaced by link, you should be looking at the reference to another patient resource in the FHIR server and using that as kind of your source of truth for demographics and probably building queries based around that patient identifier. But it does raise some important issues. If you know that patient 1 has been replaced by patient 2, what about all the resources that might be linked to patient 1 historically? If you go and do a search for observations that are linked to patient 1, even though you know patient 1 has been replaced by patient 2, if you find some, that probably means you need to consider those together with the resources that are linked to patient 2. And you might have to think about the union of those. Now, ideally, the EHR you're working with or the FHIR server you're working with will have some predefined policy about this. So they might say, anytime we're going to populate a replaced by link in a patient, we're also going to go and update all of the resources that were previously pointing to the old patient to make them refer to the new one instead. That would be an example of a policy that a server might have. And as a client, it's pretty important to understand what kind of server behavior to expect in those situations. And that's why it shows up on the clinical safety checklist because these kinds of migrations are something that the clients might need to be aware of. So that's the first link type. Let's look through the others here too. So there's a link type called replaces, which says the patient resource containing this link is the current active patient record. The link points back to an inactive patient resource that's been merged into this one and should be consulted to retrieve additional referenced information. And so these are kind of complements here. Normally in FHIR, we avoid the situation where one resource points to another and there's also a reciprocal pointer back. Normally we define one canonical direction for these relationships, but this is an exceptional case where if patient A has been replaced by patient B, we might also want to populate patient B with replaces pointing back to patient A so that we can tell the full story of how this replacement or merge has happened. And that's important in general because this might be the only indication that a given client has about this merge operation or this replacement that happened. So that's the second link type. And these are the two strongest link types, I think. Let's read on to see the other two that are defined here. There's one called refer, which says the patient resource containing this link is in use and valid, but it's not considered the main source of information about a patient. The link points forward to another patient resource that should be consulted to retrieve additional patient information. So this seems even harder to deal with as a client because it's not telling you that this has been replaced or this is replacing something else. It's just saying, well, you've got to go to this other patient record and use that one too. So this might be pretty difficult semantics to implement. As a client, I would much prefer to see one of these rather than having to deal with refer. And there's one more link type, which is called see also. Patient resource containing this link is in use and valid, but points to another patient resource that is known to contain data about the same person. Data in this resource might overlap or contradict information found in the other patient resource. And this link doesn't indicate any relative importance of the resources concerned, and both should be regarded as equally valid. So I can see textually where there's a little bit of additional detail here. See also is maybe the weakest statement of all, but practically speaking, it's not clear to me how this is really different than refer. This idea of relative importance is explicitly out of scope for see also. But refer, let's see, what does it say about the relative importance? For refer, the resource containing the link is not considered the main source of information. And I guess that means that a client should consider it relatively less important. So refer, if you're pointing elsewhere, means the elsewhere is probably a better source. Use this one, but trust the other one more. See also is, these are just both two sources of equal relevance or equal importance. So that's a pretty subtle distinction for clients to have to deal with. Because ultimately, if you're building a piece of software, you're going to have to turn these link codes into some well-defined behavior. And having different behavior in these cases where maybe you're going to merge the data differently or apply different colors in a visualization or surface up different questions to your end user, it's kind of hard to think about how you would do that in a really distinct way for these different link types. But broadly speaking, I see this as kind of a pair of, hey, there's a merge that happened, and these as kind of a weaker statement of like, hey, you should also be aware of some additional information. But those are the kinds of semantics that the clinical safety checklist is hoping that developers are going to pay attention to when it comes to patient link. Now, we've been talking about linking from one patient to another, but there's also a use case here for linking from a patient resource to this other resource type called related person. So I want to spend just a minute digging into related person and a couple other resources that FHIR uses for modeling patients and their relatives and other folks sort of in this ecosystem. So first of all, before we switch over to the related person resource, we're just going to take a quick look at where it shows up in patient, because there's a couple of spots in this data structure defining patient resource. So related person can show up as a link. And I thought it was also going to show up here under patient contacts, but I see that's not quite the case. I can see a patient's contacts are simply modeled with a relationship and then the actual demographics for that person sort of baked in to this backbone element. So, all right, this is one place where related person shows up. Let's take a look at the data model here. The idea of a related person is it might be somebody with a personal or non-healthcare specific professional relationship to the patient. So not like a healthcare provider that is maybe a primary care doctor for you. That's not where you would use related person. But you might use it to capture information about a patient's designated representative, maybe a neighbor or a caregiver, or even situations for a non-human like a guide dog that has a relationship to an individual person. And where is this resource used? Lots of places in the FHIR data model refer to a related person. So just to get a quick sense of what that's like, why does an allergy intolerance refer to a related person? Well, it's because an allergy intolerance might have been recorded by a related person. So maybe your neighbor or your caregiver is recording or asserting an allergy. That's an example of one of the places that a related person might show up in the FHIR data model. Where else does this show up? Let's just take a look at care team and procedure. So for care team, we can see a related person shows up because they could be a member of your care team, alongside practitioners and patients and organizations and even other care teams that could be members. So that's an example. And a procedure shows up. We've got a related person who could have recorded a procedure or asserted that the procedure happened. Those are the main places. So it comes down to documentation, participation in different kinds of events or teams. What is a related person all about? Well, the main thing, the sort of defining thing about a related person is that it must point to exactly one patient resource. So you could think of a related person resource as scoped to or existing within the context of that patient. And so you might have a given human being, like let's imagine there's one friendly and helpful neighbor on a neighborhood block, and that person is helping out 3 of the different folks who live on their blocks as a caregiver and a member of their care team. Well, that helpful neighbor would actually show up in FHIR as 3 different related persons. One for their relationship with a neighbor to the south, and one for the relationship with a neighbor to the north, and one for the neighbor to the east. If they're participating in the care team for those 3 different neighbors, that helpful person would show up as 3 related persons in FHIR. And the way that it's modeled this way is that so that we can focus on exactly what their relationship is to each given person, and to be able to describe that role in the context of different assertions or participation in care teams. But you might imagine it could be quite inefficient to repeat all these demographics about that friendly, helpful neighbor, and what happens if they change their phone number and you want to update all the records appropriately. How do you deal with that? There's a couple of options that FHIR provides. One thing that you can do is to populate a good solid identifier here in the identifiers array. This is a common pattern across lots of resources in FHIR. So if you know this person's driver's license number, or if they've got an identifier in your organization, you can include that here. And that way you can search for all the related persons that sort of have that same shared identifier and represent the same human being, and make those updates all at once based on that identifier search. So that's one possibility. But there's another resource that's also worth knowing about in FHIR, which is the person resource. Now, person is a bit of an abstract concept in FHIR. It's not directly used from most resources. So a person isn't responsible for providing care or asserting or recording facts. A person is really more of a linking construct. And the idea here is it can capture demographics about a person, and it can capture, in a very similar structure to what we saw in patient, it can capture links, in this case to persons or related persons or patients or practitioners. And so the idea here is if you want to model a human being who shows up in your FHIR server as a patient and also shows up as 3 different related persons because they happen to be this helpful neighbor, this person resource is what you could use to tie them all together, to say, actually there's 4 other resources in FHIR that are more contextually relevant definitions for who this person is and what role they play. Maybe they're a patient in our health system, and they're also a practitioner in our health system, as well as a member of the care team for their neighbors. We can link to all 3 or 4 of those from one person resource if we want to tie those all together. But when we're recording clinical facts in FHIR, we never point back to this person resource as the one responsible for those facts. We would point to them in their role as a practitioner, or their role as a patient, or their role as a related person. So this is really a grouping or aggregating or linking data structure that's worth knowing about. From the clinical FHIR safety checklist perspective, this gives us a sense of how a patient can link to other patients and related persons, but also should raise your awareness about some of the ways that FHIR models the individual identities of the humans who work inside of a healthcare system, or in some cases even non-human folks who participate, like the guide dog example that we saw. Before we close off this issue, I wanted to go back to this patient resource and look at this links array and see if we've really understood the use case for a related person actually showing up here. It's not obvious to me that we have. Let's go back and read these link types and try to understand where it would make sense for these links to point to a related person instead of to a patient. I'm guessing maybe some of the later link types. So for replaced by, I think it really wouldn't make sense to replace a patient with a related person. They're different kinds of entities. And so one, I don't believe, would ever be replaced by the other. So this replaced by relationship or the replaces relationship, I would expect those to always link from a patient to a patient. What about the others? So refer. Here we said the patient containing the link is in use and valid, but it's not the main source of information about a patient. The link points to another patient resource, so we actually say that pretty clearly. So the refer resource points from a patient to a patient. And let's review see also. See also says the patient resource containing this link is valid, but points to another patient resource that's known to contain data about the same person. So when I read these links, they're all from a patient to another patient. From a patient to another patient. These are the only 4 link types available, and they all deal with patient-to-patient links. So I'm pretty unclear on what the use case is for populating related person. There's one other place that we might look for a hint about why this is happening, which is the definition here, which says links to another patient resource that concerns the same actual patient. Could be used for duplicate patient records or distribution of information across servers. None of that mentions related person. Here we say, here's a comment that might give us some clarity. It says, referencing a related person here removes the need to use a person record to associate a patient and a related person as the same individual. And so this is trying to deal with the case that a related person and a person represent the same individual. I'm really not sure I understand the use case, and it certainly doesn't seem to line up with the definitions here. I bet there is an edge case that this is designed to solve, but I'm not immediately seeing it. So I might follow up with a question on Zulip, and if I do, I'll post it in the notes for this episode so folks can follow along with me. With that, I think we've been through checklist item number 8, and we're now dealing with patient links and making sure that we handle data that are linked to potentially multiple patient records. So we'll sign off here and be back next time to address safety checklist item number 9.